I said a prayer when I saw the 20-foot blue shark, because I was convinced I was going to die. Moments before, I had been filled with hope that I might swim the 3 miles to the Mozambique beach of Lourenço Marques from the burned, gutted wreck of the cabin cruiser Diana. Fascinated, despite my fear, I watched like a mouse in a snake's cage the killer nearby. His entire form was fluid, weaving from side to side. His head moved slowly from left to right, right to left, timed to the rhythm of his motion through the warm waters of the Indian Sea. Only his eye was fixed, focused on me, circling within the orbit of the head to avoid losing sight of his prey for a fraction of a second. The diameter of the circle had narrowed to 15 yards. Through the crystalline water, I could see the sandpaper skin crease with 1,000 silky furs at every movement of his body, emphasizing each pattern of incredible muscle. I could almost feel the teeth clamping onto my body, the powerful turn, and the ripping away of my flesh. The blue shark swam on. There was no threat, no movement of aggression, yet never had I been filled with such terror. Swimming as slowly and steadily as I could, I tried to keep him constantly in front of me. The huge marauder continued his approach, narrowing the circle another 5 feet or so. For the first time, I saw that stupendous jaw lined with teeth, 7 symmetrical rows of them. As it continued to circle, I drew my knife, but even as it cleared the sheath, I knew what a futile gesture it was. Even if I repelled the first attack, he would simply resume the circle of hunger and then, without warning, attack again. Drawn by invisible signals, other sharks would soon appear. Then there would be the scramble for spoils, the frenzy. The bloody and swirling horror I envisioned brought cramps to my stomach. For an hour the shark circled. The circle was down to a mere 5 yards now. There was no point in swimming further. Treading water, I waited. My strength was ebbing, and I wanted at least the satisfaction of cutting the beast so that its comrades would tear it apart even as it had me. Then the shark opened its jaws. The lower jawbone jutted forward, the snout was drawn back and up until it made a right angle with the axis of its body. Twice I struck out at the wolf-trap jaws, and twice the knife missed as my knuckles scraped alongside the sandpaper skin of that enormous mouth. With a flick of its torso, the killer veered, but instead of resuming its circle as I expected, it dashed toward me again, rolling its dorsal fin under to bring the great jaws to bear. I braced myself for the second attack. But it never came. Because I had not taken my eyes off the beast for an instant, I never saw the 2 bottle-nosed dolphins racing toward us. The first dolphin to strike was the smaller of the 2, perhaps 10 feet at most, but the point of its muzzle striking the shark's abdominal cavity sounded like 2 ships colliding. The second dolphin struck inches away from where its mate had impacted seconds before. The shark was dead. Though there was no trace of blood that I could see, the shark, doubled over like a sucker-punched boxer, sank slowly out of the blue-green into the murk below. Its delicate insides were, I knew, totally destroyed. Had they not been, the dolphins would have aimed their second attack at the gills, annihilating the beast's breathing apparatus. Looking at the 2 dolphins frolicking about me, grayish dorsal sections shading into whitish underbellies and perpetually upturned mouths that always seemed to be smiling, I was tempted to say thanks, but I stopped myself. It could be fatal to assume that all danger was past. The encounter with the shark had worn me out, and I would have to float a while to regain my strength for the long swim to shore. Besides, the shark and the dolphin are natural enemies. It was for that reason alone, and not out of any affection for me, that the dolphins had attacked. Or so I thought at the time. Taking a vacation by cabin cruiser off Lourenço Marques was a bit unusual for me, but my fiancée Ingrid thought it might be fun. "Why don't we go inland?" I had complained. "I've never been to any of the great Kenyan game preserves." Ingrid had frowned.
"Just because you're a sailor doesn't mean the ocean is out for a vacation. I haven't been to the coast for over a year."
In the end, I gave in. She lived in Johannesburg, and I could understand her desire for a few weeks at the sea. In the winter, the great gold mining center is one of the most pleasant spots on Earth. In the summer, it turns into a hot, dusty hellhole. I was not, as my fiancé called me, a sailor. Like my shipmates who sailed aboard the Thor Larsen from Port Natal, I considered myself a whaler. For over 12 years, in fact, ever since my 18th birthday, I had sailed with the great whaling fleet during the hunting season. For more than 6 months out of every 12, we'd crisscross the Indian Ocean and the Antarctic in search of the blauwal, blue whale. Those immense creatures of more than 130 tons, able to swim hour after hour at better than 15 knots. 12 seasons of hunting. You can understand why I thought cabin cruising along the shore of Mozambique was a busman's holiday if ever there was one. But 1972 had been my most profitable voyage ever. Sailing as second mate for the first time, I had picked up an even bigger percentage of a full catch that included 3 sperms with rectums full of ambergris at $40 a pound. I figured I could well afford a cabin cruiser and a long rest. It had been, by and large, an uneventful journey from Port Natal north to Mozambique. At night, we slept aboard ship. By day, we swam and picnicked among the hundreds of sandy coves that dot the coast. The days seemed to merge into one another, and the excitement I can remember is when we saved the porpoises' lives. Porpoises, as you may or may not know, are related to dolphins, but differ from them as a German shepherd, say, differs from a poodle. For one thing, the porpoise has a more rounded head without the pronounced beak of his dolphin cousin. For another, he has spade-shaped teeth instead of conical. Finally, he is smaller and generally stays further out to sea than the dolphin. It was the last fact about them that caused me surprise when I heard Ingrid screaming from the other end of the cove for me to come on the double. I couldn't, for the life of me, figure out what was wrong as I caught sight of her about a half-mile off. Like me, she was naked, for there wasn't much point on donning suits on those deserted strips of white sands.
"They'll die out of water," she was screaming as I reached her. "Hurry, Cat!"
"Don't panic," I said. "They're just porpoises, probably driven ashore by a killer whale. And they're mammals, not fish. They drown in water, not air. The only danger is their skins drying out in the sun. From the way these are lying quiet, I'd say they've been struggling for some time. Let's get back to the boat and pick up some blankets. We'll wet the porpoises down, then carry them into the water." They were all under 5 feet, and none weighed more than 80 pounds, so it wasn't hard to get them the 20 feet to the water's edge. "Don't put him in the water," I cautioned Ingrid when we hauled the first one to the wet sand. "The others will let out distress signals, and this one will come racing back and beach himself again. Let's get all 3 near the water and start them out together. Mind the skin, though, it's very sensitive." 5 minutes later, all 3 porpoises were poised near the water, giving off that curious characteristic squeak, which many scientists claim is their method of communication. At any rate, a few quick shoves and they were floating. Then they were racing out to sea. If someone had ever told me that their kin would soon return the favor, I'd have had him committed. It was outside Lourenço Marques that the Diana's fuel injector conked out, so we put into port for repairs. I, for one, was pleased to spend the 3 or 4 days ashore that would be needed. For one thing, sleeping aboard the cramped cabin cruiser was fun, only because Ingrid shared my quarters. For another, Lourenço Marques, a city of almost 200,000 people, was one of the most beautiful ports on Africa's east coast. I looked forward to a large bed in a room cooled by an overhead fan, charcoal-broiled steaks and lobsters in Portuguese fashion, and ice-cold beer to wash it all down. 3 days later, I walked into the yacht basin to inspect the repairs. I left Ingrid reading in the hotel room. "I want to take her out for a trial run," I had explained to her as I shaved. "If everything's all right, I'll pick you up at noon and we'll head north again." Everything seemed perfect as I eased her out about 3 miles, where the clear green water becomes suddenly a brilliant blue. As I let her out full throttle, I was even thinking that I'd have to tip the mechanic who had carried out the repairs. A minute later, I smelled the fire. Then I saw the smoke billowing out of the engine. At that point, there was still hope. Leaping down the stairs into the cabin, I grabbed the extinguisher from the wall and rushed back on deck. I'd read the instructions many times before, and only an idiot could have misunderstood them. To use, remove clip, strike knob on ground, keep extinguisher upside down, and jet at fire. The only problem was, an idiot had made the thing because it dribbled once, then sputtered uselessly. Cursing both extinguisher manufacturer and moron mechanic, I threw the useless hunk of metal overboard and started filling buckets, but it was too late. I would have needed a fire truck and power hose to put that blaze out. Already the floorboards were charred and crumbling. Giving it up, I rushed for the inflatable raft stowed in the stern. I reached it at precisely the same moment the flames reached the gasoline tanks beneath my feet, and the explosion tossed me 15 or 20 feet into the sea. Stunned from the blast, I recovered myself in time to see a wave was carrying a fiery sheet of oil directly toward me. Throwing my hands above my head, I submerged and stayed down as long as I could before rising with aching lungs to the surface. A wave of burning oil was safely past me, heading in for shore. I wondered if it could be seen from land. The sun was still behind me in the east, so I suspected it couldn't. I knew they couldn't see the flaming wreckage of the Diana, because in the time I had ducked below the surface, the cabin cruiser had foundered and sunk. There was no decision to be made. I had only one course of action, and that was to swim toward shore. The 3 miles didn't trouble me. I could swim before I was 4, and had been a high school champion in both the butterfly and backstroke. Besides, the waves would push me toward the land when I was tired and had to float. Treading water, I untied my plimsolls and let them sink. I was just about to remove my windbreaker when I noticed the sleeve was ripped. Then I realized that whatever had torn the jacket had also gashed my arm. Not bad enough to keep me from using it, but bad enough to bleed. And blood on the water in the Indian Ocean was a siren call to sharks and violent death. Despite the time and effort it would take, I decided to try to shred my windbreaker and apply both a tourniquet and a bandage. When it was done, I struck out for shore, swimming an even 100 strokes, then floating on my back to rest. I guess I'd swum close to 500 before I saw the fin of the great blue shark coming from shore to intercept me. As I stroked away from the specter of my death, the dolphin swam playfully alongside. I couldn't help admiring their enormous power, incongruous though it seemed, as they dashed around me like delighted children. Each turn they made brought them into my line of vision, and I watched their silhouettes, slightly blurred by the streaming water, skimming the surface like the best competitive swimmers. They limited their breathing period as much as possible, exhaling underwater and sending streams of bubbles to the surface. Suddenly, completely, the watery play ceased. I had not far to look for the reason. Less than 100 yards to the north, I saw the telltale triangular fin. Not one this time, but 4. I told myself with less than a mile between me and shore, had it. At any moment I expected my dolphin companions to flee. I was wrong. One dolphin, the smaller of the two, continued to circle me, while the larger suddenly charged the 4 approaching sharks as if to scatter them. Was he sacrificing himself? I'll never know. I began to swim furiously in the direction of land. When I could no longer put one hand in front of another, I stopped and looked back. 3 sharks were attacking the dolphin with incredible ferocity. He must have got one on his first pass. I knew that from the shattered chest of the creature, a great black bubble of air was carrying away his life. I sucked in great gulps of air, turned my face toward the shore, and began to swim again. I knew that had it not been for that dolphin, it would have been me being torn apart. I had seen with my own eyes what a pack of sharks in a feeding frenzy had done to a wounded whale. Would the 200 pounds of dolphin be enough to satisfy those enormous appetites and let me make shore? There was no way of knowing. I increased my stroke, trying to put as much distance between me and that frothing stain of blood as I could. But even as I swam, I could feel the strength ebbing. All my skill as a swimmer wasn't going to save me if exhaustion paralyzed my body. Already black dots floated across my eyes. I had to rest. How long I treaded water can't even be guessed at. I was conscious only of an enormous fatigue spreading through my body. It was at that moment, I think, that I felt the first bump propelling me upwards. Another bump. Adrenaline spurted through my system. My first thought was that the sharks had finished their bloody meal and had turned their attention to me. But when no attack came, I realized that the surviving dolphin was below me, pushing me to the surface, urging me onwards. Again, I began to swim slowly and deliberately. The rest had given me a second breath. Not enough to cover the distance that still lay between me and shore, but enough to continue. Had I stayed there much longer, I'm sure that other sharks would have appeared to finish the meal they'd had delayed. And near me, the dolphin swam. Its pace slowed down to mine. I must have been 400 yards from shore when the fatigue began to spread through me once more. I remember cursing that I was going to drown so close to safety. As I lost consciousness, I remember that last tremendous dolphin shove. The enormous lifeguard, an African from the Bantu tribe, was hovering over me anxiously when I opened my eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked in Portuguese. And when a tourist standing nearby translated his question, I nodded that I was. "Ask him how far out I was when he got to me," I told my translator. "About 100 yards, came his reply. 100 yards. When I lost consciousness, I was 4 times that from shore. Somehow the dolphin had managed to propel my body more than 300 yards towards shore. And from the way my ribs, chest, and back ached, I knew he'd been forced to exert a tremendous amount of energy. I stood up shakily in the sand and looked out toward the ocean. There was nothing but sea and sky. But I muttered anyway, "Thanks." Editor's note: in an effort to verify Kurt Giffard's story, we asked Chester Crone, author of The World of the Dolphin, Belmont, New York, 1972, if he would comment on some of the more important details. Mr. Crone's reply is as follows. "Thanks for sending me Kurt Giffard's account of his dolphin rescue. We have been receiving reports of dolphins saving the lives of drowning people for some time. The first as early as 1943, when Natural History magazine reported that a dolphin pushed a distressed swimmer ashore in Miami. 2 years later, in an official report in Airmen Against the Sea, author George Lano recounts how a dolphin pushed a rubber raft filled with airmen to a beach. Accounts similar to Giffard's have been received from Australia, Brazil, Tunisia, and other places frequented by dolphins. What makes Kurt Giffard's report so interesting is that, for the first time, the witness's reliability cannot be questioned on the basis of expertise. As a whaler with 12 years' experience, he has had first-hand knowledge of both sharks and dolphins. Every detail in his story on dolphin behavior has been scientifically confirmed. It is, in my opinion, the most conclusive bit of evidence we have ever had that man does indeed have a friend in the sea."
So this should probably go without saying, but don't take anything published in Man's World magazine as the gospel truth when it comes to marine biology. They are not an authority. Nonetheless, happy Shark Week, everybody, and thank you to all of my amazing Patreon supporters, particularly Andre D, Break System BSE, Michael Fattori, Zachary Snowden-Smith, and Zanazira for making this exhibit possible. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button, comment, subscribe, maybe even consider becoming a Patreon supporter yourself. But either way, thank you for watching and thank you for being you.